Hello, everybody, and happy Friday as we make our way into our virtual town hall. Really excited about the discussion we've got on our hands for this afternoon. We, as regulars know, one of the great parts of building this community is we get a chance to offer a forum for authors and people that are putting ideas out into the public domain. And today we're really lucky to have the co-editors and a couple of the contributors to a fantastic new book called Animals Make Us Human, which has been put into the public domain to get us thinking about the world from a much broader perspective. I'm really just going to do the intros today and hand over to our wonderful panel. Meg Kennelly, who many years ago shared a newsroom with me in News Limited and has gone on to do much better things. Leah Kaminsky, who's the co-editor with Meg of this book. Graeme Simsion, whose work I think everyone's really familiar with, the Rosie Projects, and our newly minted OAM, Dr. Clare Wright, who's also a professor of history. So really looking forward to handing it over. Before we get cracking, I just know all of you will join me in paying respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we all meet. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I know you'll join me in recognising that the land that we are all on was never ceded, and paying respect to elders past, present, and
we've lost you, Peter.
Oh, good. I thought it was me, Leah.
No, me too. I was starting to panic. All right. Well, we'll let him stay
going along in their conversation and ask questions, and we'll call some of you into the room as we go. But to get started, if all of you just want to introduce yourselves in chat, let us know where you're from. Maybe also what's your favourite Australian animal, and we can use that as a little bit of an anchor. Or maybe we should be renaming ourselves, not wanting to anthropomorphize, but really get in touch with the themes of this fantastic book, which we will be putting a link to in the chat as well. So on that note, Leah, welcome to Australia at Home, and thanks for bringing your crew of thinkers into the room with us today. And I'll hand it over to you to get the discussion going.
Thanks, Peter, and hi, everybody. Thanks for having us. Very excited to be here with these guys, these generous folk. I'll just look, first things first, here's the book, guys, all right? That's in your Christmas stocking. And for once, I'm not self-promoting. I can say that with a clear conscience because all the sales of this book go directly to two wonderful wildlife organisations, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And that split down the middle is because, I'll tell you just a bit about the background of the book very briefly. I was sitting and writing an article in the middle of the bushfires last summer in Melbourne and thinking, the poor people watching all these hideous things on telly, listening to the news, hearing about 3 billion animals being burnt to a crisp. And I said, I've got to do something. And I've never been one to, walk around with banners and shout. My activism has been through writing. So I said, I've got to get a book together. I've just got to do this. And I pitched my editor at Penguin, and they all jumped on board, really passionate about it, wanting to put together an anthology that was a fundraiser. So everybody has worked pro bono. And then I picked up the phone to Meg and said, hey, Meg, do you want to write a book about, and I think I said a book about animals, I think before I'd even finished the sentence, she goes, yes. And that split also between animals of the land and the air and animals of the ocean is because Meg is a qualified scuba diver and secret mermaid. So we, through the pandemic, I'd go into work, and I'm a doctor, so I'd don my protective equipment and then come home and get to look at beautiful pictures of echidnas and pardalotes and wombats and get these wonderful essays in from fabulous writers and scientists. And it was just very exciting. And the book is a work of art thanks to Penguin and the photographers, everybody donating their time and effort. And it's also a work of heart for me. I think everybody's really poured themselves into their stories and their photography. So that's my 2 cents worth. I might hand over to Meg and then we'll get the real stars in.
I think one of the things that Leah and I wanted to achieve with this is to help people look at the issues around wildlife conservation in a slightly new light, because people who are susceptible to the pro-conservation arguments, logical arguments, have already heard and internalized them. What we were wanting to do was come at it from an emotional perspective. So what we asked Claire and Graeme and the other contributors to do was essentially write us a love letter to a species or an ecosystem. And, it was just so wonderful that everyone we contacted came back very quickly, very passionately. And the book wouldn't have, Leah contacted me about working with her on this in January this year. It's extraordinary that it's a real life book in November, and that's down to Graeme and Claire and everyone else who just jumped in with us and helped us put this together. So we're extraordinarily grateful to our wonderful contributors.
I want to, I think Claire and Graeme need no introduction, and we sort of started before all you arrived. I guess I just want to ask you, Claire, you said that you write about dead people. You don't really do what you call nature writing, but you do, I think in a lot of your work, you do represent the natural world. I mean, there is a scene, there is a setting there. And I wonder what it was like for you to write. Just tell us a bit about your story, and just what it was like to write about your little possum, which is actually the photo that accompanies Claire's story, is the cover of the book, which is absolutely beautiful, by Kristen Bell. How gorgeous is that?
It is a beautiful photograph, Leah, and I was thrilled to see that it went on the cover. Firstly, thank you all for coming today. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land in what is now called Melbourne, that these lands were stolen and sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be. Leah and Meg, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this book. As you suggest, when you first asked me to write for it, I thought, oh God, what am I going to do? I mean, I like the idea of it, and I love the idea of contributing to a fundraiser, and I like marsupials as much as the next Australian. But I thought to myself, I am a writer of narrative nonfiction. I'm an historian. I write about dead people a long time ago. I had no knowledge of how I would work my way into this. But I guess, as you say, Leah, when I came to sit down and do it, which actually was, I did in lockdown, right towards the end, nearing the deadline, I really did procrastinate and leave this to the last minute, because I was so intimidated, I think, by the idea of nature writing. But then I decided I just had a story to tell, and that this was just like writing that I usually do. I was about a different location, but you are right. I mean, I do write very specifically about place. It's part of the way that I write about history, is to understand that people lived in a place in the way that we do now, and they interacted with their environment. In particular, I always, as an historian, look to see what's going on with the weather. And fortunately, people have been obsessed with the weather for a very long time. So newspapers, even 150 years ago in Australia, were always commenting on the weather. And so I was able to, I've always tried in my research to match what's going on in a particular day with what the weather is. And I started to form a theory when I was doing my research into the Eureka Stockade for my book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, that a lot of the tension and the anxiety and the aggravation that the miners in Ballarat were feeling in that summer of 1854, that, as we all know from our school history, exploded on the 3rd of December, was because in Victoria there is this kind of insane build-up that we get towards Christmas. I don't know that we're feeling it this year as much because we've all been locked down, but the weather starts to get hotter. You start to have this sense that the year is coming to an end. So I have always kind of charted the interaction between people and environmental phenomena. And so that became the starting point for my story as well. It starts on a very hot day in summer, a day that, as I say in the story, my family calls possums dropping out of trees days, and or bushfire days. And I realized that I did have a story to tell about a possum that happened on a very, very hot day in early January. And it was an incident that lived large in my emotional life, but I never thought that it would become a part of my literary output in any way. But I guess that's sometimes what an unexpected invitation will do. It pushes you in directions that you didn't know that you were capable of going.
Claire, I just want to pick you up on that note. I mean, as a historian, I think nature writing has a tradition. When you look back on it, it sort of comes from a time where nature was really a place of retreat from urban modernity. And it was supposed to be reassuringly refreshing. It was where we went to escape and enjoy, the bounty of nature. And we've come 180 degrees from that. I wonder whether that has informed your essay as well.
Well, the idea of the way that humans exist in nature is an historical concept in its own right. That sense that you've given there of nature as other and a place for humans to retreat to, and particularly the concept of wilderness. The concept of wilderness is a very colonial concept, and it's also part of an imperial project. And if you were living in Ballarat in 1854 and you were part of the Victorian Gold Rush, you weren't seeing nature as other. I mean, Ballarat was a big camping expedition. There were 40,000 people living in tents. Nature was all around you. It informed your daily life. Indeed, many of the grievances that those miners had was because there were so few actual human structures around them that could mitigate the effects of the weather. And then when you had these these other kind of bureaucratic, oppressive structures that were bearing down on them, this is why it all came to such explosive pitch. So I think that the concept of nature as other is it's a philosophical concept. It's extremely Western. It's an Enlightenment idea. It comes with all sorts of imperialist, colonialist, and very racist logic. And so we kind of have to be careful about seeing it that way. And certainly, one of the movements that we're seeing now, to put this in a current context, is the way that our nation is looking to Indigenous knowledges so much. As a way to live in nature, to live with the continent that we have invaded and occupied and have tried for 200 years to pretend is not what it is. And it is relying on Indigenous knowledges which don't separate human from nature, which don't have that binary logic, that don't present human and nature as being oppositional and dichotomous, and also hierarchical. And that this much more holistic view is what drawing on Indigenous knowledges, particularly now in terms of managing the land and managing a bushfire and managing climate change, is something that we are really going to have to come to grips with and take on board.
Thanks, Claire. I'm going to leave that, and I want to come back to that, but we might just zoom in on Graeme for a moment. And I mean, your experience is also, I guess, especially in the books you've written about walking the Camino, is sort of really placing you and Anne in the midst of nature. But before we get to that, I want to ask you about Gavin. I don't think that's actually Gavin, but the story that Graeme has written is about a wombat, and we've all learnt about wombats' rears recently. Would you like to tell us about Gavin?
Well, let me just sort of set a little bit of background, if you don't mind, because
Can't hear you properly. Is that just me?
Sorry, have you lost me? You got me okay?
Can you hear him properly?
Put your thumbs up if
Graeme.
you can hear me.
No, Graeme, you've got some sort of, when you speak, some kind of chime is coming in behind you.
I think we need our tech support, Zareen.
Okay, because
That's better. Come a bit closer.
Is that better? Is that working for you? No, it's not working for you. Worked fine on the test, didn't it? So, okay, if it's not working, let's switch to somebody else. I mean, it'd be a shame for me to bug people with chimes. It's not working?
Peter, can we get some tech support here? Okay. I guess, yeah, Claire, let's come back to that thought that you were just, well, let's park that. I want to hear more about your experience with the possum.
Okay. So, I don't know, I don't want to give away the punchline of my story because it is poignant, and there's a sting in the tail as well as being a curl in the tail of my ringtail possum story. So, but it basically starts on a day down in South Gippsland where my family has a holiday shack, and it was a scorcher of a day. And my sister and I decided we just needed to get out of the house and go for a wander. And we wrapped our wet sarongs around us. It was that hot. And started wandering along a bush path, and suddenly my sister spotted a little tawny grey furball at the bottom of a tree, and this creature allowed us to go over to it. It was a fat possum, and she allowed me to pick her up, and I wrapped her in the wet sarong and took her back to our house because she was clearly in some sort of distress. And this started over a week of the possum living in the house with us. I tried to set the possum free at one stage to take her back and put her back on a branch once the weather had cooled down. I had noticed that there were 4 little paws sticking out of her pouch. So clearly twins in there. And these little paws would stick out, they'd wriggle around, and then they'd go back in again. And the day that I tried to set her free, she wouldn't let me. She actually, when I put her up on the branch, she actually climbed back down my arm, sat on my shoulder. She wrapped her little ringtail into the whorl of my collarbone, and I figured she wanted me to take her back to our house. So I did that, and she lived with us for a few more days, and then well, okay, I will tell you what happened. She deposited her 2 little babies on the doona of our bed one night, and they were the 2 little twin possums were dead by this stage. No more little bouncy legs, and they just lay there still on my doona with their little ringtails entwined. And then that night I tried to put her back in the bush, and she scampered off. So she had decided to live with us and until her own emergency had passed. And it was just, Leah, an incredible moment of, well, I guess it was, the title of your book is Animals Make Us Human. And watching all of that unfold in front of me, it did actually draw on all of my humanity, my powers of empathy. I've got to say, if I can just digress, and then we'll see whether Graeme's coming back. 16 years ago, I lost my own twins. And, I hadn't made the connection between these 2 stories until this week, actually. Because last year at the Sydney Writers' Festival, I was asked to participate in an event called The Full Catastrophe. And we had to tell a story, get up and tell a 10-minute story about some event in our life that had been the full catastrophe. And I wrote about losing my twins. And yeah, it's a humorous and sad and poignant story. And I'd never spoken publicly about it before. And I hadn't seen the need to. That happened 16 years ago. I wrote the story last year. I had cause to publish the story this week because a wonderful woman called Isabel Otterberg is writing a book about miscarriage. And she had asked whether she could publish that story online on her website, Hard to Bear. So if people want to read that, it's on the website Hard to Bear. And she published that. She put it on Twitter, and somebody who had read my story in Animals Make Us Human also read the story on Hard to Bear, and she pointed out, this is a complete stranger, pointed out on Twitter there's parallels between the possum story and my own story of losing twins. And it had never occurred to me. And I thought, oh my God, how thick are we humans? You know, what is this? What is the power of denial? I'd empathized with this possum. Clearly, I had written my story into her story. And, you know, she wasn't another species. I don't know whether you call that anthropomorphizing or whether you call that empathy. I don't know what the language for it is, but I'd felt a deep connection with this possum. And I guess now I have some more personal insight as to why.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I was part of that kind of Twitter group watching that. And I must admit, when I read your piece and then came back to read the possum piece, I was like, yeah, wow. That was, your subconscious was incredibly courageous, even if you didn't know it at the time. But they were both two beautiful pieces. I wonder, are we getting Graeme back? Got so many questions for him. We'll take you with your feedback too, whatever it's called. Peter?
Let's just try this. Let's just try this one more time. Are you still
Sounds
chiming?
a lot better, Graeme.
Yep. And I want Meg to jump back in too. But so let me take you back, Graeme. You're walking the Camino with Anne, but first we were going to talk about Gavin. Tell us a little bit about your Gavin.
Yeah, look, if I could just set a little bit of context. First of all, is that sounding all right for you now? Can you get with it? Okay, so let me just set a little bit of context, because when Meg said that you were chasing an emotional reaction from readers, I must have skipped that part in the invitation, because I'm not the obvious person to choose for that. I just finished writing a piece in the voice of my Rosie Project protagonist, Don Tillman, in a little book called Don Tillman's Standardized Meal System, about the ethics of eating meat. And Don is an uber utilitarian philosopher, if you like, on these matters. And he's the sort of guy who would say, you know, why do we feel so bad about the Canadian baby seal, and we don't feel the same way about the rat that we ordered to have eradicated or whatever? And, you know, he's recognizing, as I do, that our relationship with animals is look, it can be all sorts of things, but it can also be quite problematic, particularly when they intrude on the sort of life that we want to have. So I was put in mind of a wombat who had invaded, as it were, or made his home underneath our little weekender, and was working away assiduously at the foundations. So we had a really quite serious problem with competition for space, and I guess we could have walked away and let the house fall down. But friends had a similar issue, and they'd put up a fence and gates, and it's quite an expensive task to it, because these are very, very keen animals who will dig under almost anything you put in place. So they'd put up the fence and everything like that to look after the wombat. And as soon as I brought in our local handyman to suggest he do that, he said, bang. He had a very simple solution, legal or otherwise, that we could take the wombat out. And what I wanted to do was to explore, in some ways, the ethics and the emotions around all of this. And I guess one of the inputs to this was one of the first books I read on utilitarian ethics, which is Jonathan Glover's Causing Death and Saving Lives. And he talks about what is absolutely the title of the book, Animals Make Us Human. he says, you know, the logic might be that rather than helping one individual, you should send the same amount to help 10 individuals in a struggling country or whatever. But the logic behind this, this care, this some of the quite expensive care that a utilitarian philosopher might otherwise reject for an individual animal or indeed an individual human, is about making ourselves human, about expressing compassion, about doing some of the things that make us human beings. So I wanted to write about that tension, if you like, in the story.
Really interesting. When Meg, you can jump in here too, but I must say your essay stood out amongst all the others in terms of just the fact that one of the potential solutions offered to you was lead poisoning, as you called it, that, you know, that the wombat could potentially be shot. And when I read it, I was like, oh. And
I guessed that and read the feedback, and my partner Anne Buist has also got an essay in the book, and she said, I don't think they liked this one, Graeme. I don't think it's what they were looking for.
We loved it, but yeah,
eventually.
But then I sort of Meg and I talked about it, and we sent it to Meredith Curnow, who was the overseeing editor of the whole thing, and I waited with sort of heart in my mouth, excuse me, this is Yeti who gets in on the act, waiting for her response. And she wrote back and she goes, this is terrific. And I said, what about the kind of, you know, the bit about the shooting? And she goes, oh, Graeme will get away with that. She loved it. So thank you, Graeme.
It's interesting too that there's, you know, what we don't often talk about is particularly in the past, that there is a practicality to our relationship with animals as well, the way in which we live with them and share our homes. But what I also thought was great, Graeme, is that your wombat was christened Gavin by your kids. And isn't it interesting, the power of naming?
Oh, and that is really the whole point of the essay. That the moment you anthropomorphize the animal, even though we understand that a wombat is not a particularly human animal, the wombat is, you know, a wild animal. It doesn't want to be cuddled, even though it might look cuddly. And you know, as I say, from the point of view of our local handyman, you've got a pest there. We want to eliminate the pest. If we brought him for a rat, the argument would have been probably settled a lot more quickly. And that was, you know, and a fly, well, you know, so that was really the heart of the story, and the fact that, you know, once the kids had called him Gavin, it was a foregone conclusion, and by God, they probably knew that.
Yes, but you know, this whole idea of anthropomorphization, in my piece, I wrote that there's a particular fish that I like to hang out with in Guy Miguel waters at Shelley Beach near Manly. And I can't help but anthropomorphize him because he's got so much personality. But at the same time, I wonder whether I should, whether I have the right to, whether it's arrogant, this whole discussion about whether anthropomorphizing animals unfairly puts all of our human faults onto them, or whether in fact it helps us get closer to them. What do you think?
Look, I think some animals are more anthropomorphizable, there you go, than others. And say Canadian baby seals apparently more so than rats, more so than flies, and so forth. And putting aside all sorts of questions that might rationally, if you like, make the animal closer to us, such as level of intelligence, and so forth. But their big eyes matter more than smart brain, and flat faces, all those sorts of things. And I think those are issues that we have to grapple with. We exploit animals. We destroy animals to make room for what we want to do. These are all parts of the way we live. And I think that sometimes you need to take a hard look at those sorts of things and make your decisions based on that. And again, it's a tough question. You say, do we shoot the wombat and donate the money to wildlife conservation? You'd save a lot more wombats, but it's the anthropomorphic argument that gets in the way of that.
It's really interesting. I guess you're right. The whole book is about personal encounters with wildlife and Australian wildlife. And I wonder, we've also got encounters, Geraldine Brooks writes about the huntsman that lives in her bedroom, bringing the wilderness in to her house. We've got Nick Porch, who's an insect expert, writing about a beetle that he's been pursuing his whole life. I'm wondering, do these personal stories, do you think that they engender empathy and compassion in the reader, especially for an unmet creature, one that they have never heard of, or is not, as you said, the big-eyed, beautiful creature, beyond the ones that we call charismatic animals? Do you think that there is some, writing these personal encounters can bring the reader into a love of animals, of our wildlife?
I think it's a really tough question. I mean, look, surely the answer is yes, it can do that. Whether it's the best way of doing it, or even if that's the outcome that we want. Do we want people to relate to individual animals, or do we want people to care about wildlife as a whole? And this is a whole sort of a logic versus emotional argument. And you were having a little bit each way there when you were prioritising, reading between the lines, Australian wildlife. So we feel a little bit differently about the Australian bird that's being killed by the feral cat than we do about the feral cat.
This brings me into a different area, Graeme, because I guess what I'm asking is, can writing activate people's environmental conscience? But you're getting into a whole realm of sort of compassionate conservation, which I'm not really sure I want to go there in this forum, but there is certainly a movement. I'm not convinced. I think I'm probably on the other side of, who's to determine which species.
Okay. I would actually push back and say it's a value-laden statement when you say, can you activate their conscience about this? Because you're saying this is something they ought to do. And an enormous amount of writing, I think, the author seeks to engender a particular, encourage a particular view, a particular form of action, and so forth. And look, we certainly all believe, I think, that good writing, and particular writing which is not on the nose, writing which is subtle and which teases out the issues and so forth, can change people's views. So I would say absolutely good writing can change people's attitude to conservation, towards wildlife and so forth. But I think we're very careful to some degree of just standing up and folding around and saying, this is a good thing and needs to be done. There are competing, as I was arguing philosophically, there are competing draws on our resources, on what we choose to value. Do we value wildlife over flora, over people? We have some terrible poverty problems in the world. And there are plenty of people who would argue that that wildlife comes second to those problems. I think you have a bunch of competing voices, all asking for readers, for people out there to give priority to the issues that matter. And I think they're all entirely legitimate. But I'm just careful about putting too much of a value judgment on it and saying it's raising consciousness for sure. Conscience perhaps is a little more value laden, but yeah, look, absolutely good writing can change attitudes. I think there's much doubt about that.
In writing these essays, Claire and Graeme, did you feel, this is a loaded question too, was it kind of a form of activism for you?
Claire? It's always a form of activism, isn't it, Claire?
Oh, well, I do see my writing as being a form of activism. I see my research as being a form of activism. I'm a revisionist feminist historian. I can't separate those two things. And yet my writing is always based in evidence. That's the pact that you have with your reader as an historian, is that you're not going to make anything up. And therefore you can't push a barrow through history and just put in the bits that make sense to the argument that you want to make. That's not history writing. That's writing a polemic or a manifesto, and that's not what I do as an historian. I think that this conversation we're having is incredibly interesting, because if I reflect historically on the possum and the way, and I just have also, it's just come to I've just come to realize, dumb human that I am, that I have written about possums before. I wrote about them quite extensively in The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, because in 1854 in Ballarat, possums were food. So I think that where you fall on this side of, you know, good animal or bad animal, or whether it's anthropomorphizable, also depends on how hungry you are and what the other available sources of protein are around you. And the fact that the miners were starving, and that the possums were full of trees, the trees were full of possums, and that the Wattarung people knew how to get them from the trees onto a stick that you could put in the fire. And the Wattarung certainly realized very quickly that they had skills and knowledge that was going to be of benefit to all of these strange invaders who had just come in and were looking for this crazy yellow stuff in the ground. And so the possums became food. They also became furs, darlong they were called, possum skin rugs, possum skin cloaks. If you made any money from gold mining, that's the first thing you did, is you made yourself warm from the animals. So, you know, I don't think anybody was going around naming them or worrying too much about the costs, the ethical or environmental costs. And should they have? Well, you know, of course, now we can look back historically and realize the ways in which European invasion of the country has also had terrible devastation to the environment. But if we placed today's consciousness or conscience onto those people 150 years ago, we would be writing a very ahistorical narrative.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, particularly because Claire, you write non-fiction habitually, and habitually I write fiction. So this was very much a departure for me. But even when you write fiction, if you write a polemic, if you give your characters speeches in favour of a particular political view or whatever you have an activist position on, you'll be preaching to the choir, because all the other readers will have thrown the book against the wall by the time they're a couple of chapters in. I mean, I have an activist position in my Don Tillman books. I have a particular position on autism, but I feel obliged in writing to lay out the opposite position, the contrary positions, as clearly and as honestly as I can, so that the reader of the story who perhaps might hold that position will feel it's been fairly represented. I'm not trying to slant or tip the scales so that the reader will go my way, because I believe I'm right. So if I believe I'm right, that will come through, but it won't come through by me dishonestly representing or underrepresenting the opposing view. I think your values, and as I'm sure I know Claire's do, come through in what you write, whether you like it or not. You might say, Claire, you're taking a relatively objective view of history as much as one can, but nevertheless, your own values will imbue what you select, how you convey some of those facts. But equally, as an historian, it would be irresponsible to leave out those parts which you might find unpalatable, which you now disagree with. And you've just been very open about attitudes to animals 150 years ago.
Exactly, and I think that raises another question, is that you know, I have an activist heart and spirit, as you do, Graeme, but we're all writing from a sense of positionality, and one of the things that a position that you and I are writing from when it comes to writing about animals is that we are white people who have grown up with that Enlightenment tradition and philosophy. Leah and Meg, one of the things that's wonderful about this book is that there are so many Indigenous contributors to it. Bruce Pascoe, Nayuka Gori, and you know, from my own experiences of living and working with Yolngu people in Northeast Arnhem Land, the concept of anthropomorphizing in itself is a completely foreign one, because it's not that there's not a relationship with animals, but actually those animals are, I mean, it's the wrong word for it, but they're spirit animals, you know. So so the clan that I'm most associated with, the Gumatj people, their animal is the baru, which is the crocodile. And that, it isn't like that's the crocodile, it's that's my grandmother. The crocodile is my grandmother. And all the painting and all the song and all the dance is telling stories about the animals that are associated in a totemic way. And I'm not romanticizing that, just saying that that's actually how it is. There is actually no division. This whole binary idea between nature and culture and human and animal just actually doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to Curly Saunders the other day, and she is another writer with a piece in this book. She's a gunite writer and artist. And she says she's often late to work because if she sees an echidna crossing a road, she's got her echidna towel in her car and she gets out and she helps it across to the other side of the word, because echidnas are messengers and she has an obligation to help it on its way. And she writes very movingly in the book about Garrel, the black cockatoo. But, you know, it's interesting to me that, and I think a little ironic, that what you were saying earlier, Claire, about your survival needs dictating the way you relate to animals, which of course they do. And, you know, another thing that Curly and I were talking about was, particularly white Australians, non-Indigenous Australians, we are conditioned to talk of ourselves as separate from nature. And the very society which has allowed us to separate like that has also, A, helped destroy the natural world, and B, put us in a position where we are well fed enough to look at the conservation aspects of wildlife. I've always found that sort of cycle a little bit ironic. But as well, for me, in writing my story, there is a very nerdy aspect to me where part of me was just saying, look at this fish, how cool is it? And I think that came through in a lot of the pieces, including both of yours as well. So while there is a very intellectual part of it, and while it does raise the questions that we've been asking and answering today, which is, it's great that it gives rise to this sort of discussion, I like to think that there's that nerd inside all of us who goes, oh, it's an echidna, how cool is that? You know, that sort of thing.
Certainly Tom Neely has written a beautiful piece about echidnas, pointing out amongst everything else that they have 4 penises. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, we needed to know that.
For me, also, my piece was about ducks. Sorry about my cat here. He's just chiming in. This is Yeti. That I wrote about my absolute lifelong love of Pacific black ducks. And one of the things that I write about is that being that nerd that, you know, used to work at a delicatessen and donate my $4 earnings a week to Laurie Levy's Coalition Against Duck Shooting and sponsor a wild duck, when the Freedom of Information Act came out, I decided I might find out whether ASIO's got anything on me. Not that, you know, I didn't do anything. I wasn't a radical at uni. I was just a dag. And lo and behold, came an envelope with my name on it, full of, you know, I was a real threat to Australia. And spoiler alert from the essay, but basically it was because I had sponsored Laurie Levy's duck activist, you know, anti-duck shooting activist parties, because of the duck that I was on their list, rather than the 100,000 people that were out there with semi-automatic rifles and camos shooting, you know, eradicating species. I'm just wondering, Peter, have we got time for some questions from the audience? Are you going to herd cats?
I will try. There's been some fantastic discussion going on. One thing that's been coming through, and we will ask a few people to come up and ask their own questions. But while I'm doing that, I think there was a comment about the debate about koalas in New South Wales at the moment, which has become a proxy for land clearing. So it's created a huge schism in the New South Wales coalition between the National Party and the Liberal Party, where national MPs want to protect the farmers' rights to clear their land, even at the cost of koalas. But ironically, at the same time, they are vigorously opposing moves to cull brumbies in the high country, where, in terms of the idea of literature being part of the conservation story, the images of brumbies all the way back to Banjo Patterson seem to have defined them as an untouchable creature. So the politics of animals and you know, iconic animals in at least New South Wales politics is quite intense and, you know, sometimes a little bit counterintuitive, where the stories sort of push up against the reality of caring for the broader ecosystem. Don't know if anyone wants to comment on the koala stuff that's going on though. We will see. Sue Luce, I'll see if Sue's available. She's been making a few comments in the chat, whether you'd like to get your camera on, Sue.
My camera's on.
You there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello.
My camera's on.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
I found this really, really interesting. Very homesick for Australia and missing the animals there terribly. But I think the one thing that has really struck me is coming and living in New Zealand is that possums here are not a native species, and of course are slaughtered because of eating whatever the birds need to have, and the decimation of the trees. And I just, I'm having a really difficult time here to reconcile that because, like you, I formed an association with a possum, and I just, I think that we perhaps anthropomorphize animals because it is our only way of really understanding them, because it's coming from a point within us, and we tend to project some of those feelings onto the animals, but it's also a way of learning more about them. And if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. So I think it's incredibly important. It's not the only way to approach these, but I think it is one way of us making meaning and understanding.
So I think you raise a really interesting point, and Meg, you'll agree with me. Some of the most amazing contributions we got are from scientists to the book. And when we, you know, they talk, it's a pity that we haven't got one of the kind of more science geeks here that could talk to that really eloquently, but they're trained in numbers and measures and measuring and data. And yet what we needed to get from them was the heart of the story. And once we sort of edited it, and Meg was really good and much more diplomatic than me at this, getting to the heart of their story about the beetle they were chasing, or, you know, the dingo that they've spent their whole life researching. Yeah. It really did often boil down to that personal connection, didn't it, Meg?
It really did, because we, I don't think, and initially sometimes we didn't ask the right question at the start. And then when we went back to them, we asked, all right, what was it? What was the single moment that made you decide to devote your entire life to researching this species? And what came back was extraordinary. We had an entomologist talking about parting the leaves on the forest floor and finding a metropolis underneath them. We had a reproductive biologist saying she fell in love with the carnivorous marsupial when it bit down through her fingernail, and to add insult to injury, it had just eaten the species she was studying at the time. So, you know, everyone loves a bad boy. So, yeah, and if you are going to devote your life to studying a species, you better be in love with it. And it was just wonderful to hear the genesis of those relationships.
Graeme, may I ask another question? Sorry, I don't know if we've got much more time left here, but I'll steal another little one. Oh, okay, I'll be really quick. Coming back, I wanted to bring you back to the Camino, and you and Anne often get away. You've got a little sort of country heart, and you know, I saw on Facebook yesterday you've got some incredible camping contraption you've got to get up to with a ladder, if I may. So you're always seeking nature and seeking to get out there. What's your connection? What drives you, and what role do animals play in that?
Well, you probably should ask Anne, because she is in fact the driver here. And you know, walking the Camino, a fairly long version of the Camino, which Anne and I ended up writing about and novelising in 2 Steps Forward. I wrote the male character, who is a little of me in him, is an engineer who was quite oblivious to his surroundings, to nature. He was doing a trek, and it was a physical challenge. And, you know, people go out into nature to do these sorts of things. They say, I'm going to try to walk from here to here, and to hell with what I see along the way. That's relatively incidental. It's all about what's happening for me, a very egocentric sort of way of going about it. And look, the truth is it opened my eyes. It was, for the first time in my life, I really felt significantly connected to nature, because when you walk for 3 months, as we did, you watch the seasons change. You're in amongst it every single day. And it's quite possible to live a city life as I do without having that sort of contact with nature. You can really wall yourself off. And I think a lot of people do. And I think people who are very connected with nature often don't realize or don't empathize with people who live that very, very different, disconnected life and would see nature as an occasional recreation, as something to go out and to walk in the forest. Oh, that was nice. Rather than having that day-to-day awareness of nature, and rather than really valuing it in a strong way. So it was eye-opening for me. They say the Camino changes you, and it changed me.
Make a point there about the day-to-day connection with nature, which was something I was thinking about this morning on my daily dog walk. I spent the first lockdown in Melbourne at the beach shack where the possums live, and I spent the second lockdown in Melbourne, and walking daily became my sanity and my salvation, as it has for many people who had lockdown, and thank goodness for the dogs. But one of the things that made me do was to focus on and concentrate on the nature that lives in the city in a way that I had never done before. Because, you go for a walk and it's in between, I've got to walk the dogs, and, you're just kind of filling up it's kind of more procedural. Whereas there was something that was actually more spiritual about my city walking in that lockdown. And I was thinking about this week because there's a tree just down the road on my daily walk. Jacinta Damas, who is here in the audience, lives around the corner from it. She'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And there have been a pair of owls in that tree, tawny frogmouth owls.
They're not owls. They're not owls. Got to correct you.
What the hell are they?
They
Leah?
are tawny frogmouths. That's what they are. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupt.
Well, there's been a pair of tawny frogmouths in this tree, and every day, you walk past them and you wave and say hi. And then a few weeks ago, one of them wasn't there, and it wasn't there for a while, and then both of them had disappeared. And I know lots of people in the area started to be concerned about what had happened to we'll call them owls. And then all of a sudden, last week, they're back, and they've got a baby there with them. And so there's now 3 of them on the branch, and the baby owl is just absolutely spectacular. And so this kind of daily observance of and even just the fact that of looking up into the tree, not looking ahead, not listening to what's going on in the in the ears, not looking at the phone, but just looking up into the trees has become actually I think an incredibly grounding, anchoring point, I know, in my life and a lot of other urban people over this lockdown.
That brings me to another interesting question, which we may not have time to answer, but I guess maybe, Graeme, I'll throw this to you. Our new way, or our new form of experiencing live nature has actually moved online. We watch YouTube videos of dolphins and whales and bats. My daughter posted, she was on a beach yesterday and a skink came and ate her pear, and she posted it on Twitter, and it's gone viral overnight. Do you think what do you think this means? Is there something to read into this?
Oh, look, I don't know. It's going to broaden what you see, your experiences, and it's going to take you far deeper into it, because you've got the David Attenborough who's taking you on this journey. You've got the informed guide. You're getting a very different perspective from simply walking by something and saying, wow, that's a very attractive bird or whatever. I mean, there's currently an octopus documentary around that everybody is watching, and
that too.
and watched it the other night and said, what have we got for dinner? And I said, I've got some calamari.
Oh.
And then it was just like, no, we're not doing calamari tonight.
A lot of people have said they're never eating calamari again after watching. It's called My Octopus Teacher, and it's available on Netflix, and if you haven't seen it, it is really quite extraordinary.
Yeah. So look, I think all of these things are complementary to personal sort of live experience. But I really do feel, certainly my Camino walking gave me a very different experience from watching any number of documentaries. And that's because it's that rhythm of the seasons and being in and amongst that, which again is I guess the way that people historically experience nature. They weren't watching it on YouTube or documentaries. It was around them. It was their experience. It was what was local, but it was an intense form of that.
It's interesting because one of the arguments about David Attenborough is, as much as we laud him, I've read, arguments that he's actually, through his whole career of documentary filmmaking, has led us into a false idea that there is such an abundance of wildlife in the world without tackling what humans are actually doing with. And I think towards the end of his life, he's come sort of 180 degrees to address that in his last documentary. But yeah, watch it if you haven't seen it. It's quite fascinating.
I think there's always an argument when you're talking about somebody with the enormous influence that someone like David Attenborough has. But equally, I think we need to recognise that different people bring different perspectives to, my teacher, the octopus, or the octopus, my teacher, that's just one perspective on octopi. Then you'll have a perspective about the evolutionary aspect of them, which is probably a lot more clinical and so on. You'll have your own experience of swimming with them, whatever. And different researchers, different presenters are going to highlight different aspects. Just as this book highlights, I think, a particular aspect of the way that we interact with animals, and it's a tremendously valuable aspect to have. It's just not the only one. We need that plurality, I think.
Sorry, just to come in there. I mean, when I watched my octopus teacher, I did learn something about octopuses, but I actually thought the documentary was much more about the man himself. We learnt more about him, and I think that is something that's interesting about all these stories in the book. We're learning something about the animals, but for me, reading your stories, I'm not thinking about them in terms of good and bad animals, or there are the nerdy things. I learned from Graeme's story that wombats do square poo, and also why. Thank you, Graeme, for filling me in on that. But I've also learnt an enormous amount about the writers themselves, and I think that actually it's a way of expressing vulnerability in ourselves when we write about animals, or when we write about the other. I'm sure Jung would have something to say about that. For me, that was one of the real draw cards of this beautiful book, which I do really encourage people to get. As you would have heard, all the funds raised from it are going to nature conservation. So great Christmas gift to give away. But, what binds all the stories together is just really exceptional writing. Every single piece is just exceptional. And I really did learn so much about the writers themselves, things I didn't know before.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we probably need to wrap up fairly soon, Peter, but I really wanted to thank both Graeme and Claire for coming along, again, contributing their time for free, as well as their essays for free, and Meg for just being there the whole time. She's just been a joy to work with. She's fantastic. It is a great gift. I'm going to plug it, and some of the other writers that we feature: Tony Birch, Geraldine Brooks, Melanie Cheng, Keridwin Dovey, Nayuka Gori, Paul Kelly, Fable Parrott, Bruce Pascoe, Holly Ringland. I mean, really, we were like kids in a lolly shop, weren't we, Meg?
It was like getting a Christmas present every second day when these essays started coming in, and we would call each other and squeal about how delighted we were with them. We'd ring up and say, "Oh my God, did you see Claire's piece? Did you see Graeme's piece? How incredible!" So it was a real joy in a very, very dark time.
And to do it, as a fundraiser, it was very liberating and just fun and wonderful. So really thank you so much to both of you. And Peter, for organising this wonderful forum. What a great group of people. I want you all to be my best friends. And I apologise for my feral cat, Yeti, getting in on the act. He always does that.
Well, I'm sure I speak for all of the authors in saying, Leah and Meg and your team for putting this together. Wonderful, wonderful initiative. And if you manage to get so many, noted authors involved, well, that was the efforts that you made. So you should be immensely proud of what you managed to achieve.
Thank you, Graeme.
Very
Thank you
kind.
very much.
And just in the interest of winding up, thank you all for visiting our town hall today. For those of you that aren't regulars, you're now on our list, so you'll be invited to future events. We've actually got another book discussion next Thursday with Christine Jackman talking about her new book, Turn Down the Noise, which is a meditation on meditation and noise in society. So another great, conversation to be had. But thanks, Leah, and thanks, Meg, for taking it today, and have a
And
great
Lucy
weekend,
for
everybody,
organising
and
it.
look
Thank you.
after yourselves. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,